Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, whenever you're watching or listening to this, and welcome to Link Up Leaders, your direct link to leaders in supply chain and e-commerce. My name is Lisa Kinski. I'm your producer and co-host, and joined as always by Francois Jeffrey. Francois, how are you today, dear?
I am great. How are you? Happy Friday.
Good. Happy Friday. I'm loving your new t-shirt. Long
Thank
sleeve.
you. Yeah.
New brand. Love it, love it.
Yeah. How's any plans for this weekend?
Francois, I always
Big
have plans
plans?
for the weekend.
I know, but like
Always.
any anything you care to share
Yes.
that
Well,
you're gonna get into this weekend?
I'm celebrating one of my friends' birthdays tonight, going up to Woodstock and grabbing dinner. And then one of the 10 little monsters that I call nieces and nephews. One of my nephews is he just turned 10 on the 2nd. So we are going to Stars and Strikes to celebrate his birthday, which, having been a Brunswick employee for so many years, feels like fraternizing with the enemy, but I guess I'm far enough removed now that I'm allowed to go in there. But
So it's another
yeah,
bowling, like a bowling
yeah,
bar.
yeah.
Okay.
It's another family entertainment center, so they have like bowling, arcade, billiards. Some of the locations have darts. This one in Woodstock actually has axe throwing too, which I'm pretty excited about.
Awesome.
Some of them have like laser tag. It depends on like the size of the venue, and then also what like licenses are able to get, insurances and things like that. And then fun fact, laser tag is actually a rented service. I don't know if anybody knows that. So you actually rent the majority of the family entertainment centers, like Brunswick Zone, Main Event, Andretti's, Stars and Strikes. Those vests and the actual service to run the games and stuff is rented from another larger conglomerate. They don't own
I did not know
any
that.
of it. Yeah.
Oh wow.
And when your center leader forgets to pay the bill and it shuts off in the middle of a Saturday night, it wreaks havoc.
Yeah.
So,
No, I bet.
yeah. What do you do this weekend?
Nothing. I'm relaxing.
Good.
So hopefully catching up on some sleep. Might go get some brunch tomorrow or Sunday, and just overall, hopefully a relaxing time. Our team is able to relax overseas with Chinese New Year right now. I'd hope to be as relaxed as them this weekend.
So you're not going to work this weekend, is what I'm hearing.
Well, see, that's the concept of relaxing is very weird, right? It's whatever you consider
really
relaxing. I mean, I'll probably catch up on a few items and just feel productive, right? I mean, I think at the end of the day, that's my definition of relaxing. Just feel productive for the day,
Okay.
or it helps me relax. So hopefully, just do a little bit of work, but ultimately just relax.
Gotcha. And go to the gym.
Yeah, and go to the gym.
Gotta get in the gym. Awesome. Well, let's go on ahead and bring on our guest for today. Today we have with us Paul Ruppert to talk about conversational commerce, e-commerce. I wonder if maybe we can get a fun story from working for presidents. I don't know. Let's see what we can do. Paul, hi, welcome to the show.
Hello, Lisa. Hello, Francois. Pleasure to be here.
Hello.
And look forward to a good conversation, and hopefully it's productive for your listeners as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've had nothing but incredible guests. And this is exciting. This is episode 99 of the
good
show.
Number. There, very good number. Back to the Chinese New Year. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, is it?
I
know the doubles of numbers are good, but some are less
88
lucky than others.
Considered the best of luck, but 99 is an imperial number.
Love
meaning
it.
Of the emperor, as is the color yellow. I lived in China for 9 months.
Okay.
So I know, I learned a fair about China when I was there. I've probably been there about 25 times during the course of my career.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but before we even started the podcast, we started just diving into your. Can you tell us about your general? Because you're such a unique guest. You have so much experience.
I'm not
unique. In both. you are extremely unique. You have so much experience in both the public and the private sector. Right, and working with so many different industries. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got started and
sure,
I guess progressing into e-commerce?
Wow. Well, how I got started. So the genesis point, if you want to call it that, was not being hired by the Central Intelligence Agency to be an analyst. I had gotten recruited by the CIA, and it's an extensive program of interviews and tests, a little over 6 months at the time. It was right when I was in college. And even one step back, I'm certain I got the call from the CIA because I got rejected I wanted to become a naval intelligence officer, but they told me I was too nearsighted. This is 30 plus years ago, ladies and gentlemen. There were no wars. And so got scrubbed and then went into the CIA process and embraced it. I happen to be half French. My father was an army officer during World War II, married a very young French woman, and I was the byproduct of that. And so when I didn't get into the CIA after being, as I say, 3 days of interviews in Washington, D.C. and all kinds of tests and things like that, I recognized that I wanted to move to Washington. I was just finishing up an undergraduate degree in political science and dove into literally $400 in my pocket and to my life, if you will. Got on a bus and came to Washington. About 5 months later, I was working for a United States senator. And that put me on the first track, which was a little over a decade, where I was working as a legislative assistant to a senator from Missouri named John Danforth. And from there, pivoted into all the various elements. You know, the political world is definitely a business. It's an industry in terms of how it's run and managed. Became a policy expert, like in enterprise zones, tax abatements, various types of initiatives to help develop urban and rural economic areas, essentially blighted areas, you know, trying to figure out what kind of incentives could be provided. Ended up working for a cabinet secretary named Jack Kemp at the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Ran political campaigns, essentially being a marketer. And eventually, as a result of being involved in the presidential campaign for George Herbert Walker Bush, not only when I was a sophomore in college, but then arcing forward to when I was in graduate school at Harvard, I was brought in to help the George Herbert Walker, you know, the Bush Quail campaign in 1988. And so was able to have that type of career and all the benefits from it, you know, whether it's negotiating, marketing, ability to talk to anybody, anytime. I'm one of the other coolest job I ever had was being a political advance man, which is essentially somebody who's responsible for all the logistics of a principal's engagement, from the time a principal being like a president, cabinet secretary, vice president, etc. Get off a plane, do the entire day, get on a plane, get out. There are people, there are teams that are put together to manage every minute of that exercise, every minute of that 3 hour, 4 hour, 6 hour period. And it's a lot of fun. It's highly stressful.
I was going to say, that sounds awesome. That sounds like
logistics.
Love.
Yeah, exactly.
And like people can never stay on time. So it sounds extremely stressful.
It is. And you get, you know, once you move up, and I worked for a guy, this is way off our topic, but I worked for a gentleman named Rick Ahern. And Rick is essentially the godfather of the political advance world. He happened to even be with Ronald Reagan when Reagan was shot in the assassination attempt. You can actually see that footage. And Rick is a big Irish bloke with, you know, these tortoiseshell glasses. And you see Reagan getting hit. And then you see Rick, who happened to be a former policeman, dive right into the process. And I got trained by Rick later on, as did many, many advanced people. And you know, most of us were volunteers. I happened to be inside the government at the time. So you get plucked out of being a political appointee, and then you being applied to, okay, we'd like to put you onto this team. And the team literally is comprised of a finance. It's very much like a startup, in fact, in its structure. You've got essentially the founder, if you will, or who's the principal manager, the CEO of the team. So I had that type of role. But you also had a press liaison. You had a security liaison to work with the Secret Service, especially in presidential and vice presidential candidate activities, as well as organizational, finance, media is all put together. And it's usually like 3-5 people who come in, take over, make sure everything's being operated. And all, it's not taking over like we're changing everything. It's just you are now getting into the last phases of the mission, if you will. And that once the principal, as I say, clock goes off when he gets off the plane, and you continue to move through the process until you put him back on the plane. It was a great job.
Wow.
And nobody really knows about these things unless you're like a journalist or, you know, a political operative, but it was a great job. and really extraordinary people who do it as well. Because, as you say, most political campaigns, again, very similar to startup initiatives, are run by volunteers and manifested and organized by volunteers. And some of the volunteers that were part of my teams, I mean, I had Wall Street lawyers, bankers, really stellar individuals that wanted to be involved in politics, and this is how we utilize their skills.
Wow.
And
We're not
fascinating.
talking about
It's a lot.
e-commerce, are we?
No, I think it's all going to tie together. I mean, we're only a few minutes in. How did this lead you into more of the private sector, though?
Well, a lot of the policy work that I was focusing on, as I mentioned, was like tax policy and let's call it impact of bureaucracies on commercial activities. So the roles that I held in various political appointments, I was a chief of staff to a program officer at the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs. Now, what's important about that? Well, you want to try to be able, at least from our perspective during the Reagan era, was to try to minimize the friction involved in contracts with the federal government. That way you can have smaller entities being able to make that type of application and position themselves for potential supply of a service or capability to the US government, which benefits everybody. So instead of having the bureaucracy slow it down and creating the friction, the objective was, how do we make this easier for the consumer being the general public, or the companies that were looking to get and be able to provide those types of services. So that was kind of the focus of, and the efforts. And then later on, I was even a trade association lobbyist for technology trade association, early on, mainframes, large companies, as well as startups who were involved in it. So that was my mindset. And along the way, I started recognizing that I think I was tapping out in terms of what I wanted to do. My patience, it's a young person's game. And, at the time I was thinking, I think I got out when I was around 34, 35. But when I say young person's game, we're talking about 20s, early 30s, to do that aspect of it, not to be the principal, not to go off and run for Congress or something like that, which is candidly what I was first looking at. My father ran for Congress when I was 6, had that type of exposure, and recognized very early on that was not going to be for me. So I eventually told myself, time to get out, and took a little while to try to make that, convince others that the solutions and the capabilities, the experience that I was able to learn, garner, however you'd like to describe it in the political world, would be applicable. And there was also, it became like this, a little distracting, because instead of discussing how I can bring value to a commercial enterprise, they were talking about, well, why would you want to get out of that? That's really kind of cool. When I'm like, well, it's only cool if you're in office. Okay. If you're on the right team that is in office. Otherwise, you're in the wilderness. You're always trying to get back. That becomes a different dynamic. So, but thank you for asking,
No, of course. And transitioning into this world of e-commerce, I guess it seems that, especially since I grew up when there was no e-commerce whatsoever. I mean, today it feels almost like everything is transacted online. I mean, whether that's buying cars to purchasing your car insurance, you're not necessarily going into even like a State Farm anymore. You're just checking everything. Everything is sort of leading to e-commerce.
It's just the first stage.
It's just the first stage, and it's skyrocketed just in the past decade, I would say. How did you start to get involved in the world of e-commerce?
Well, that was determined by my luck to get into an opportunity, which was mobile services, mobile telephony, at the right time, at the right place. Sometimes, no matter what you do, sometimes luck has and fate has a command over your destiny that you just can't manifest and overcome. So I was looking, because again, back to my personal background of being half French, I was looking at Europe in terms of opportunities where I might be able to try to get a job. And had been working with an executive recruiter that happened to be a friend of a friend. And we were talking about one day how I just started to discover how the German rail company, which was a public entity, was going to be selling its wireless services, that it was essentially, Spectrum that they were going to be auctioning off in Germany. And that's a pretty technical undertaking. But again, leveraging some of the connections that you have sometimes in the political world, I was talking to an investment banker at Lazard Frères, which happens to be a French-based investment bank back then. And I was talking about that, and he goes, I think you've just landed on the best opportunity, because we are looking at that. We are looking at that as a potential investment, because we think that mobile services, which really didn't have a term as of that time, are going to take off. And so I started squirreling in and thinking that I'd go to Europe to find that type of job. And then recruiter, meaning somebody inside the recruiting firm, called me up and said, I know you've been talking to Dick Schmidt, a real person, and I've got an opportunity that Dick isn't aware of, because he's in Europe, but we're in California, and we are staffing out the launch of a new wireless mobile business here. And that was an arm of Pacific Telesis, which is one of the larger telcos, as they used to be called back then in the 90s. And that was a result of breaking up AT&T. And oddly enough, this company that at that time was branded Pacific Telesis today is part of AT&T Wireless, because they essentially the management, primarily chairman and CEO of Southwestern Bell Corporation, then reconfigured and went off and bought all the other pieces, brought them essentially back together as he could. One of them is known as Verizon. It used to be called 9X. So that's how I got into the first stages. And as a result of being in the right place at the right time, and then getting involved in the phenomenon of text messaging, I happen to have 2 patents in the space as well, as a result of being in a startup as well as being in this large mobile network operators, they're called. That was the trajectory. And I was always focusing on end consumer behavior, because that was a natural fit for me. If you go from political campaigning, what are you talking about? You're talking about an abstract concept. Right. And that's what you're selling. And now we've got a real life concrete service that we were offering in terms of convenience more than anything else, because wireless telephony that we're all benefiting from these days starts off with being untethered from being wireline, meaning you're no longer tethered to the wall. You are now free to roam. And that's part of the catalyst and the spark that has grown this business to what it is today. So that's how I got into the space. Now, arcing forward, I came into a startup after doing 5 years in a mobile network operator, massive enterprise, Fortune 100 type company. And as those act sometimes, they don't make very rational decisions. I had been an international roaming director for the company. And what does an international roaming director do? Well, he negotiates all the B2B contracts with other mobile network operators all around the world. Okay. And this is before the advent of video. So what that meant was, okay, Paul, you got a $250,000 travel budget. Figure out where we need to be able to make the relationships that's going to be able to build out our roaming business. And that goes back to then consumer behavior and travel behavior. Our footprint was California, Nevada. Just so happens that we have the top 7, both commercial and tourist destinations in the United States, including San Francisco, Vegas, et cetera, et cetera. We go through the list. And then you start looking at travel. You start looking at airline travel, and you start looking at voice, and just classic voice minutes, meaning people calling somebody. And there's a huge amount of traffic that goes, for example, from California to Asia, obviously, as well as to the UK, obviously. And then, so I built a business plan around that as an international roaming director. So 4 years into this great gig that I had, they were like, okay, we're restructuring the company, and we would like to put you into a distribution role in Nashville, Tennessee. And we want you to be managing handsets and working with OEMs, original equipment makers like Nokia and Ericsson that used to be around back then. And my perspective on that was, no, I don't think so. I don't think that's going to work. And also because of the reality of my role, which was almost like a quasi-commercial, quasi-product guy. I was literally, we were based and headquartered in San Jose, California, otherwise known as Silicon Valley. So part of my role was to filter through various startups that would come to us and say, we've got a proposition that we think would be great on mobile, but we'd like to help you. And could you help us in doing that? And so part of that role was making strategic investments in these various startups and seeing that. And as a result, you start developing your own network, and you network out into the venture capitalists who want to be able to get a first mover advantage on their noble competitors, in the sense that, hey, if you see something, because it's all about deal flow, Paul, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, okay, well, I turned that around and said, look, this is what I've done. If you see anything you think that would fit. And one friend of mine was like, yeah, I think there's one that we're looking at right now. We're going to be giving a term sheet to, which was a startup that was in text messaging. And what they were doing was taking text messaging, which was native, meaning just embedded into the GSM radio format, as it's called. And through an IP connection was able to send to non-native GSM mobile radio format. So this gets into the technology of how all this works on various spectrums. So what that means in civilian speak is you can send a text message from T-Mobile US to Verizon, which you couldn't back then, because Verizon didn't have text messaging. They didn't have SMS, as it's technically called. Nor did, like AT&T Blue, which was another subset prior to all of this, as I say, consolidation of the business. And to me, that was kind of like, I didn't know you could do that, but this looks pretty good. And I then had some conversations with board members and said, look, your founders are focusing just on the domestic US market. You're missing the fact that in the domestic US market, there are only about 25, 26 different mobile network operators that are utilizing GSM. But the rest of the world are 1,100. And the United States obviously is a major economic driver to the world economy, right? So the real leverage that you're going to get is not putting message or being able to send messages between Verizon and T-Mobile US. The real leverage you're going to have is the rest of the world being able to send it into, whether it's Verizon or Nextel or Sprint or US Cellular or T-Mobile or Aerial, etc. And the board was like, yeah, we agree with you. So that's how I got into the startup world. And 5 years later, we sold the company for $430 million. And my responsibility, which was to build out that offshore business, I owned about 62% of that, which is a little over 65 million. And it built out offices all around the world. So that's how I got into the commerce piece of all of this, because what rides on SMS? Commerce. So today we talk about that in the form of, in my business, we call that application to person messaging, enterprise messaging, now being characterized as CPass. And then CPass stands for Communications Platforms as a Service. So in your mind, think about how you today separately use SMS, or separately use voice, or separately use WhatsApp, or what other OTT, over the top type providers, which might include WeChat, which is in China, the Chinese diaspora, or Line or Kakao, which are in Japan and Korea, as well as in-app push messages that we already utilize. Two-factor authentication, which is when you're getting tested, you're getting a text message, which is a 6-digit code or 8-digit code, etc. And then additionally, the old style email. So we have all these separate platforms that I've just talked about. And the CPass idea is all of these are brought together, and it's one solution. And by bringing it all together, one provider like that, that's where it starts to have an impact on e-commerce, because it's now being characterized as conversational commerce. So whether it's voice, or whether it's video, or whether it's messaging, that's the platform that's being utilized, as well as exchanged. The nirvana state, as I call it, is when we're at the stage where you might be texting, let's say, United Airlines, because you just received a notice that your flight is delayed out of Washington, D.C. to Beijing. And you're doing that and you're texting, but the artificial intelligence has an understanding of your customer data and your profile. And so there are all these aspects called customer data platforms that is now starting to emerge as a major contributor to the development and the adoption of the usage of CPass platforms. And it shows that you are a platinum flyer, a global services flyer with United Airlines, like I used to be years ago. And so all of a sudden, the artificial intelligence pushes you right to a red jacket. And the red jackets are usually the senior customer service people that are allocated to the heavy flyers. And you get a call. Okay. And the call is, hey, this is Lisa with United Airlines Global Services Desk, and we've seen that there's an exchange that's been going on, and I wanted to just introduce myself to you, and we put you on the next flight out via Newark, and this has all been set up. And there's going to be somebody who's finding you inside the United Airlines, the United Airlines Club. And they'll find you in a few minutes, but we've already gotten your bags, pulled off the airplane. And that is all an effect of how all of this is becoming integrated and digitalized, as well as becoming much more efficient and beneficial to the end consumer. So that's a long answer as to where I started and how I got here, but this is where we're all living right now, or what we're living with that.
I think this starts to tie it all together, especially understanding your background in the public service as well, and understanding that essentially everyone in the U.S. is definitely a consumer, but also the customer in this case.
Sure.
Now, is this something, and what you described just sounds like a very advanced and complex CRM, right? Just a customer relationship management tool. Now, is this something that we're seeing cross industry tie together? Like, for example, if someone is flying with United, is that something that we can see, or maybe we're seeing it already today, and to my ignorance, I just wouldn't know it, Amazon picking up on this and understanding that you are traveling more, and maybe to push more advertising for travel and leisure products or more expensive products because you are such a frequent traveler?
Yeah, that's exactly the case. The use cases and the applications that are being applied are only limited by the creativity of the innovators who are looking at the space. So that translates into the application developers, because you'll find, this is now getting really deep into the weeds here, but there is a category of this, which is unified communications. But unified communications doesn't have this integration capability, and that application is just having a lot of different connectivities as opposed to an integrated, synthesized, synchronized capability. And so now what's going on is that these use cases are starting to flow through the likes of healthcare, logistics, as you mentioned. I used to track, I was head of sales and marketing and product for a well-known large enterprise messaging provider called mBlocks, which is now part of a larger one called Cinch. They acquired us. So back then, which is now 5 years ago, I used to track 12 different segments, and I'm going to look off camera, and it's essentially OTT, financial services, logistics, travel and leisure, telcos, meaning mobile network operators, automotive, insurance, IoT, which is Internet of Things, which includes utilities, oil and gas, education, gaming, government, and customer experience. Now, of all those, the most attention and the most energy right now is on customer experience, meaning customer care. Because if you can shift, the estimate that I heard recently was there's about $1 trillion of expense, and in terms of the size of the business for the customer care business on a global basis is about $1 trillion. And if you can shift, what's the principal interface for customer care? Telephone calls, voice calls. And if you can shift that to a more efficient platform like messaging or video or other things, that has knock-on effects, ripple effects that go through the system. Because, if you start talking to call centers, most call centers can't, they have 100% turnover in 90 days. So if you can
Wow.
if you can reduce the type of pressure that's engaged. So this is now going from what's called synchronous communications. I talk, you talk, I talk, you talk, that type of ping pong effect.
Mm.
And there's a pressure that builds on the customer care rep in terms of how fast can I solve this, et cetera, et cetera.
Sure.
Well, if you shift to, I'll send them a text message, and the artificial intelligence will look at this, and they can, this is some of the ideas that are coming through the system now. They can identify your intent and your sentiment, how you're feeling, and what's this all about? Because of the past behavior. This goes back to those customer data platform functionalities. And so that all becomes much more integrated. And if you can provide a solution with Amazon, let's say on the customer care side, but in the same way, if you can provide, for example, a means to have a communication channel during disasters. So that would be for utilities. Now, they may not be pushing, let's say, 1 billion messages a day across this channel, but at one point, they may need to send 1 billion messages in 2 minutes to their entire
Like in
footprint.
Texas when we saw the when we saw the winter storm.
Correct. It's like an insurance policy. You put it up there, and you want to have the capacity and the capability and the direct connections to that footprint. And that's the type of thing, even with United, where you start having that functionality of how weather patterns, like in Texas, are now migrating to the East Coast in terms of that's the usual weather pattern. So you have what you think is going to be a 1-day event, but in fact, it's a 4-day impact on travel. So all this becomes intertwined with digitalization and the direction that we're going. And even the evolution of how messages work. Today we're talking about text, and in some cases you might have hot links relative to your text. There's a next generation of messaging called rich communication services, where you have payment capabilities within that context. It's much richer visually, much more powerful, and that's also in development right now.
Well, and
This is fascinating.
I had a question.
Partly complicated, but this is why you have long questions. Well, long answers, short questions.
You're dumbing it down for us. So
yeah, we
well,
appreciate
no,
it.
two people that had no idea
this is
about any of this.
Back to where you come from. Okay, in the political world, I was always taught you got to have a message that's going to be resonating both in strip clubs and convenience stores and boardrooms. Literally, that was the quote. It's been with me forever. It was a guy named Lee Atwater who was very, very famous back in the day, and unfortunately passed away young. But the reality was, okay, you've got to be able to take these complex capabilities and make them in a simplified, digestible, approachable way. Because when I sit down, and when I have sat down with enterprises or marketing agencies, they're not in my space. They have no idea. And candidly, most times they don't care how it works. Just make sure it works. I don't care how it works, but just make sure it works. Meaning they're not interested in the bits and bytes. They're not interested in how the engine is structured, the methane, ethane, oxygen levels, et cetera, that is essentially driving an F1 car. They just want to see the output, which is a winning race. So that's the job that I have, to be able to bring those two together, marry them, and have a positive impact for everybody.
Yeah, I had a question about something you said before, just because I'm curious. When you said that the AI with text messaging is able to or will be able to determine how you're feeling and kind of
sentiment and intent, yes.
How?
I
only ask that because it's such a common occurrence when you get in an argument with somebody because you didn't call them on the phone because they misinterpreted something that they saw on the screen. I do it through text. So I'm curious.
So intent is, let's say, the first step. Sentiment is a lot more complicated. But as I've understood it, essentially this is machine learning based on your behavior and your past engagements. Now, if you don't have a record of anything, there's going to be less likelihood of them being able to guess your sentiment and intent. But then that just depends on how wide a net the customer data platforms is bringing together based on your past behavior. And this gets pretty big brotherish at times in terms of, do you want to have that type of profile of readily available for commercial and interests, because there are always negative unintended consequences. So you may not know what they are, but that's kind of the discussion in terms of, let's go to big thinking here. What's the innovation that we could potentially harvest?
Yeah, I mean that is it's a very fine line, right, between how much you want to give up and how much you want to get back. I mean, we've all benefited from today's experiences, and I'm sure we've all given up a ton of privacy in order to do this. Anytime that we go
sign
online.
up for Google, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, like unknowingly so. Nobody reads like the terms of use for the apps. Like it.
Yeah. So I mean, I think ultimately we all have a profile. No matter what, it's just depending on the
credit union or credit or your credit rating is a profile. So
yeah. But I did have a question stemming back to when you were talking about the sort of digitization of the space and that necessity in order to move forward with this plan, right, of cross communications and understanding data and delivering a better customer experience. With historic supply chain methods, right? We're talking could be last mile trucking, it could be port yards, it could, and especially when you take that to a global base, where you have freight forwarders that are interacting with the shippers and importers, and all of this very manual and physical document in Excel. It just gets overwhelming when you start to really think about it. But when you I guess, do you see this getting into more of a digitized space?
Well,
and immediately I think of Flexport. When I think about
that's kind of the hoped for endpoint, because that's going to provide greater efficiencies, higher returns.
Right.
Part of what I do is I advise financial interests who are looking to make various types of investments in this space, in the messaging aggregator and CPass space. And those entities cover everything. I've had conversations over 100 in the last 5 years, with private equity firms, with venture capital firms, with credit banks who are not looking to invest in the company, but they want to have an understanding of the business because the business has gone off and is looking for a $30 million loan. As well as sovereign wealth funds and family offices, etc. And that's the question that's always posed in terms of, can this be run better? And where are the points? Now, all that complexity that we've just talked about, how a message is sent is kind of very similar to the road networks all around the interstate network, or shipping lanes, etc. Somebody goes off and forges that type of connectivity. And that's essentially the mobile network operators. That's what they've done. Originally it was wireline, copper installations. Now it's that plus everything that goes up into the cloud, and even the reality of your own mobile phone call. When you make that call, it's only, quote, mobile or in the air until it gets to a cell tower. And the cell tower, that's the wireless piece. And from then on, it then gets routed through hardline copper or fiber optic. Okay. So when you're making a telephone call to the UK, it's not bouncing off of, some satellite that might be up there, or millions of satellites that might be up there, or millions of cell sites. It's that one that's closer to you, probably 2 to 3 miles, maybe a mile. And from there on, it all goes through hard stuff, if you will. So up to, being able to manage all that, that's what these companies that I mentioned earlier, like the one that I was involved in, you have to manage the flow, because these are routes that you have to pay for. You pay access to be able to send a message to Vodafone in the UK or China Mobile in China, etc. Okay. And notwithstanding all the algorithms and the capabilities of the financial world, The bottom line is all of these industries, all these entities that I've been involved in, there's usually a guy or a team of people, men and women who are looking at this, and they're the trading desk. So yeah, they're looking at spreadsheets, they're looking at volumes, or at the same time, they're making financial decisions as to this particular customer. Let's say it's Wells Fargo, has to have this type of capacity and speed of delivery to these destinations. But this other particular customer, which is a soccer association, and they need to send out their distribution of notifications of games and scores, etc. That's way down on the list. So they don't need to have that premium connectivity, if you will. And that's how you manage the business. So to your point, yeah, you theoretically, you wish that all this could be run, by an algorithm, but at the end of the day, it's still somebody who's creating that algorithm. And in most, I haven't run to any companies yet that is a pure digital exercise. It's usually a team of people that are making those types of connections, because they got to secure those connections. So they're not only buying and routing, they are both buying and routing in terms of their roles. More complexities that we can, savor on this early Friday morning.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm sure with enough data, more and more high level decisions will have to come from people. But even the decisions that they're making today, probably, would you say in 5-10 years, a lot of those can even be automated with the amount of data that's coming in?
That perspective I just gave you, I could have given you the same perspective 5 years ago. And yet we're still, and digitalization continues to accelerate, and the adoption of these things continues to get compressed. And yet, I, for example, one individual that I worked with now 15 years ago still has the same job. He's a critical contributor to how that company works. So yeah, back to theory versus practicality. Theory would say yes. Practicality, no.
Yeah.
At some point, like in the sales game, there's this phrase where one throat to choke. Okay. Which is, who's the guy? Who's the person that's going to be responsible for this?
Yeah.
And, if you start, we had a failure in the algorithm. Okay.
What guy wrote the algorithm?
Who wrote the algorithm?
Where's the guy?
Yeah, exactly. So, this comes down to those kind of considerations sometimes. There's still the human factor. Let's be, my perspective on this is the industry, the reality, you were talking earlier, kind of the crossover or the convergence between the public good and private opportunity, right? And the public good in all this is we have a platform that is readily acceptable, that is universal in its delivery functionality. It is very simple and very glimpsable. And when I say glimpsable, if you think about it, originally at 160 characters, you'd get a text, and this is pre-iPhone. You'd get a text. You didn't need to read it. You didn't need to stop and read it. You could glimpse at it, and your brain would be able to process it, and you knew what was being sent to you, whether it's 1 dozen eggs, 2 milks, French fries, or whatever it might be. And so that dynamic is driven by human factors, human factors analysis. So when we start thinking about how all this will work, not only, for example, this is getting really into the weeds now, but I mentioned earlier the evolution of messaging. So if you know about the hype curve, in hype curves, in terms of new technologies that are introduced, oftentimes you have this trough of disillusionment, and it takes a long time to get out of that trough of disillusionment. And the hype curve is essentially up at the top, where you have a new technology and everybody's circling and saying, oh, this is the next best thing since sliced bread.
Like Amazon.
Yeah. So the dynamic of that is we are now in kind of a trough of disillusionment about this evolution of the next version of messaging, because it's not being adopted quick enough. And there are external factors like COVID. Over the last 2 years, the use of messaging on a global basis has spiked to about
Mhm.
30%. And some guys that I know who are responsible for sales forecasts, when I check that number with them, they're like, well, Paul, we're looking at about 40% over the next 3 years, 40% growth rate. Prior to that, we were percolating along with a mature product cycle at around 8 to 10% on a global basis. Now, way up there. Well, just think about our behavior. I don't know if you've ordered a pizza lately to have it delivered. I will admit that I did not order a pizza to be delivered to my house well over a decade. And then, pandemic
And then
hits. I'm like,
COVID.
what the heck? Let's I'm going to order a Domino's pizza. And, and I'm going through this. And again, how my mind works, what I do for a living, there were 8 messages sent. Confirmation of sale, when it was being prepared, when it was being cooked, when it was taken out of the oven, when it was being transmitted to my house, when it was being in the neighborhood, when it was being delivered, and checking that I was COVID, I was following the COVID protocols. And I'm just seeing my phone light up, and I'm like,
just blowing up.
For a pizza.
wow, this is
For a
really
pizza.
fascinating. And tested again on a personal level. Bought some iPod. What are they called? Apple earpods. Thank you. AirPods. Yes, thank you. And went to Best Buy. Also, 6 messages just to pick. And this was another new term that I discovered, which was buy online, pick up in store, which was BOLPIS, BOLPIS. I was listening to a webinar, and I'm like, what was that word? I'm trying to figure out what the word is. And then later the guy explained, buy online, pick up in store. And that's exactly what I did with Best Buy. So there are these things that are still driving messaging that make messaging extremely effective, very simple, very digestible, both from consumer and the enterprise side. And the last piece, we've been talking about all these different functionalities and capabilities, use cases. So they estimate that there's somewhere around 6 to 10 trillion text messages sent annually. Okay. I don't know. I've been involved in macroeconomics and government and all this other stuff. And I've always tried to rack my brain as to, I don't know what economic production units are measured in teens of trillions on an annualized basis. I haven't found that yet, but SMS is. And so there's discussion, is there something that's going to displace SMS? No, not in my view, not in any time soon. Or what's going to come around for the next iteration. And a lot of analysts are assuming, not, based on their research, not assuming, but their studies show that only about 6 to 8% of the world's businesses utilize text message as part of their customer engagement. Well, if that's
why do you think that is?
Well, whole host of reasons. So I'm not going to give a broad stroke, but the reality is that traditional marketing channels, i.e. print, radio, television, now online, have been, we're all human beings. That's what they're comfortable with. Right. And so when you start talking about something that's going to be hitting something as intimate as your mobile phone, I mean, that's the reality. We don't even share it with our spouses or partners at times. Right. There's a reluctance, and that's just a matter of, that's a bad selling process from my industry that have not been able to, instead of turning this into a technology and selling it on a technical basis, which often occurs, and instead looking at what's the end result. I mean, if we took what unarticulated demand can we satisfy by providing this type of use case in messaging, thinking outside of the box, think like Jobs, if you will. And that's something that's the failure of the industry that I'm involved in. I mean, this is the kind of things that I've talked about for a long time in industry forums, et cetera. We're trying to do that. But that's one of the reasons. But there's still a huge upside. So,
do you think any e-commerce company today needs to start implementing an SMS strategy And we've had SMS experts on this, not to your caliber, more so those that are focused on the
I'm
execution
just
and
old, that's all,
implementation.
'cause I've been there a
Well,
long time, so
you're experienced.
yeah, okay.
But do you think every e-commerce company should start investing into this SMS capability? And I ask
Absolutely, I
that
can't see why
because
not.
that is a big conversation today, right?
I can't see why not in the context of, um so personal story, about 15 I started consulting in 2008. My first client was Facebook. And a little while later, a VC approached me and started showing me a company that was a messaging aggregator that they were called. But the whole value proposition was it was in Africa, and it was essentially an alert for you to take your medications and
Mm,
prescriptions.
Okay.
And so the time frame now that we're talking around is 2009, 2010. Well, okay, back to real life in 2022. Um, I was, privy to a presentation that was provided to CVS. And guess what? That was kind of the cornerstone in terms of here's one of the things that we can do, but there's so many different other things that can be done. So, my point here is, recently I got my haircut about 3 weeks ago, and my salon stylist, guess what? Confirmation of appointment with text
Mhm.
messaging. Auto mechanic. I've got a friend who started one of the largest aggregators. He recently got acquired, I believe, by Twilio. In fact, his name
mm,
is Rob Lauer, and the reality was that he started off his business just focusing on mechanics, primarily the automotive. The what do they call them? Like Ford and GM, all the various franchises that are
Mhm.
mm,
utilized, whether it's your local, et cetera, but they essentially rent those names and processes, et cetera. So all of these things are great opportunities to be involved, and especially in e-commerce. I mean, even such things as I understand it, um, abandoned carts can be
Mhm.
pointed
right.
to or can be alerted relative to text messaging, confirmation of purchase, two-factor authentication relative to your credit card. All these things are all intimate to the e-commerce experience. So if you're not in it, I'd be curious as to why not. And
Well,
it's not that expensive, to be honest.
I think
Yeah.
one conversation we've even had, and that we've had many times on the show, is the fear, the fear of implementation. It seems and from everything that you've described, it sounds like maybe a good starting point would be status updates, right? You got
Mhm.
everything about your pizza. You even got a confirmation that you were following the COVID guidelines. All
Mhm.
statuses that you're more okay with, and what you
Yeah,
described is a very intimate setting, right? Your
yeah,
phone. Uh,
absolutely.
but I think as marketers, that's not necessarily the level of operation that you think of. You typically think of, hey, how can I sell something else to this customer?
Yeah,
And I think that's where the fear really starts to come into play. I don't want to be overbearing in this very intimate
yeah.
setting because they could shut me off at any time.
Yeah. Again, back.
That's yeah.
I'm sorry, Lisa. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I do think that that's a large part of it because that's one of the easiest ways to lose one of your contacts in your email list is to send them too many, so they hit that unsubscribe, even if it's going to the promotions tab, which now Gmail recognizes, hey, you haven't opened an email from
Hmm.
Shein in 3 months. Do you want to go on ahead and unsubscribe from this? But I think another one of the reasons that so many of these e-commerce business owners aren't implementing text messaging, which we've talked about a lot, Francois, is that they're exclusively Amazon and they don't actually
Hmm.
have any of that
Right.
data. So it's not something that they can implement. But for those
That's a
on,
good point.
Shopify, WooCommerce, BigCommerce, internationally, Lazada, any of them, I mean, I think to Paul's point, they should. Yeah, they definitely should look into it if they can. But I think that might be why a large part don't.
Yeah, you got it in the context of. I mean, you're the pros from Dover on this one. I'm just the amateur, but the reality is that that fine line that you have to walk as a disciplined marketer. That you're not. You might be selling something, but you're not manipulating them,
Mhm.
Hmm.
and you're not crossing that boundary. That you're just becoming a nuisance, and that's just opting out. That's why we have what's called TCPAP, which is a federal mandate in terms of you've got to opt into certain engagements, i.e. text messaging. And if you say stop, you cannot be sending more text messages to them. Otherwise, it becomes very, very expensive penalty for doing that. So, yeah.
Yeah.
And so are there any studies that have recently come out, not necessarily to the world of e-commerce, but customer interactions that businesses can take a look at, like that they can
Oh yeah,
see, hey,
tons.
this is overbearing?
Oh well, that part.
Hmm.
There's a lot of, in fact, I recently undertook a study and identified 59 different analysts who've written white papers and reports just on the CPass space. Um, One that you can download directly from Juniper. That's pretty recent, just last fall. There's another one by Arthur D. Little. Both of those are in the public domain. It gives you a sense of what CPass is all about. Now, specific to your inquiry, I would be looking for, Gartner reports, Juniper, the rest of them that are looking at conversational commerce. Now, most reports are usually a snapshot of performance, if you will, not necessarily consulting. That's what I do in the context of here's the data and let's start with your answer, where you want to
Right.
go and what you want to be as an e-commerce player utilizing text messaging. So that's starting with the answer, and then let's snapshot what you have today. And if you're starting from scratch, that's okay. Let's do the gap analysis and figure out how much time, money, people, meaning the number of people, talent, the quality of the people that you're hunting, time, money, people, talent, will, how much of a will do you have for this project? Time, money, people, talent, will, and technology. So the technology you've got, because you've got guys like me who have the right access, who can direct you to the various providers. But the bottom line in all that is, all those things that I mentioned, except one, can be coordinated and manufactured or obtained. And the one thing that you don't have is time. You can't recreate time.
Right.
So if time is a factor relative to your competitive posture, and you've got somebody who's already doing stuff like this in your space, even if it's the dentist, the salon, the mechanic,
Right.
whatever else, or it's American Express or Wells Fargo or whatever it might be, start now. Because it's kind of behind the curve. But there are a lot of people a lot of enterprises that do this. I mean, Navy Federal Credit Union was a customer of mine back in 2012, 10 years ago, and you can see them on television a lot. They have that as part of their marketing exercise, but they also utilize text messaging as the array of weapons that they can marshal to drive customer engagement and create a better experience for their end consumers. That's what it's all about here.
When you see the marriage of those two, with infomercials and ads being, the historic marketing way to attract your customers, and they're telling you, hey, text this code to this number, and we'll start giving you X information.
Yeah.
Ultimately, what it sounded like is, building a roadmap to implementing text into your service, which sounds like it's inevitable. Everyone's going to have to get there, but it's whether you have that first mover advantage. And like we were talking about before the show, it's the willingness to blitzscale, right?
Yeah.
So
that term blitzscale, yes, exactly, and that's a critical element. And the last piece in all of this, try to kind of capstone our conversation back just relative to blitzscale. This is a global business, because I've just been utilizing various types of use cases that if you're United Airlines, and you might be in Burkina Faso in sub-Saharan Africa, and you're on a Star Alliance flight, that message has got to get to you, even though it's originating from your offices in San Francisco or wherever you're headquartered. So this is something that you got to keep in mind as to what your use case and functionality requirements are, but at the same time, this is on a global basis. And you mentioned Amazon earlier, so there's been a lot of consolidation. I've been active for 2 decades in this space, and what I I used to call the company that I was with a cockroach startup. Well, these cockroach startups are now becoming multi-billion-dollar
Mm.
entities with market caps of $10 billion or more that have grown up over the last 2 decades as a result of the phenomenal use of text messaging. And the reality now is that there are all these others that range anywhere from $5 to $100 million in revenues or $250 million in revenues, but they are relatively small cap, small companies all around the world. And so there's a consolidation that's going on right now over the last like 5 years. And that's kind of where I've played. That was my sandbox where I've helped these companies take over other companies or target other companies. And where we are right now is we've gotten to the scale where Cisco has just recently bought one of these companies called IMI Mobile. And there's also rumors of the fact that Microsoft might be picking up one of these, which is really kind of a trivial, almost de minimis expense for them.
Yeah.
Even Twilio, which is one of the largest players in the space for a whole host of reasons, not necessarily a pure aggregator, but they bought a couple of companies. One was a customer data platform called Segment last year, and they are marshaling and bringing together these platforms. So they're going to have a platform of platforms. And as a result of that, they get bigger and bigger. And that's why the guys like Microsoft or Amazon or potentially Google are looking at this as to, well, why don't we just pick up one of these and really invest fully? I shouldn't say Google because they've got other messaging initiatives going on. But the others, as I say, Amazon, sure, we can pick that up. Let's go do that. And then they become that becomes a major component of their entire array of capabilities.
Wow. So we're going to start getting texts from Amazon now too.
Well, I didn't say that. I'm just saying that's a potential possibility.
Probably. I think we call it a probability.
3 Ps. Okay.
Yeah, no,
Awesome.
it's fascinating, but it's terrifying at the same time about how much, when we get into privacy and all that good stuff, how much we're willing to give up to actually live what we feel today is a more fulfilled life. I mean,
there are trade-offs.
That's a deeper, more philosophical
Exactly.
conversation than we have time for, unfortunately.
It's just like discussing risk horizons, and people, well, we want to diminish the risk. It's like, you can't. I mean, you just walking out your door. I mean, if you're in Dallas, Texas today, I've got a lot of involvement with companies down there, they're all shut down. Well, you could be walking to get your mail and you may not have salted your sidewalk because there may not be salt in Dallas at the moment. And guess what? That's a risk. And then bang, you've broken your hip. Who knows? Life's a risk.
Yeah, and taking that on a global scale, it's if we don't do it, someone else is, right? I mean, if you don't get it done in the U.S., let's say China or someone in the EU, France, Germany, someone takes up that opportunity. It's all going to happen. It's inevitable. So it was exciting talking to you today.
And even just that last point, the evolution of, let's say, the origins of these companies, most of them were in the U.S. back in the turn of the 1999 to 2000, et cetera. They were all getting formed. Now we've migrated to Eastern European, Latin American, Indian. So that's just a reflection of those markets were untapped. Their growth rates were faster. Their market may not have been as large, but there were individuals who saw an opportunity and decided to take that risk and start something. And in many cases, they've started publicly traded companies now. So all good stuff.
It's exciting.
Definitely. And I'm going to stop Francois while I can, while he's taking a breath, because if I don't, we'll go for 2 hours. So, Paul, thank you so much for being here. I wanted to give you an opportunity to direct some folks to your website to work with you. So tell us just a little bit about Global Point View.
Yeah, the easiest way to contact me is via LinkedIn. So my full name is Paul R. Ruppert, and that's how I'm listed over there, as opposed to Paul Ruppert, who happens to be a restaurateur and book owner in the Washington, D.C. area. Good guy. I've met him, in fact. But that's the best way to reach out to me. And you can find more about the projects and some of my own background at globalpointview.com.
Perfect. And we'll have that in the description of the video as well as the audio version. Paul, thank you again so much for this very, very interesting conversation. It's nice to know my text messages aren't just Wonka vision like I've always thought they are.
Okay. Well, Lisa, Francois, thank you very much. I very much enjoyed it, and I hope your listeners enjoyed it as well, and
I'm
found
sure.
something interesting in all of that.
Oh, I'm
Yeah,
sure that they
that's the
did.
goal.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for everybody who's tuned in today. If you liked what you heard, please give us a thumbs up, comment with your thoughts about the show, share with your friends, subscribe, and be sure to turn on those notifications. That way you never miss a conversation with leaders in supply chain and e-commerce like Paul Ruppert. And we will see you guys next week for episode 100. Everybody have
Here
a
we
good
go.
weekend.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Bye,
Thank you,
guys.
everybody.